Welcome to another deep dive, everyone. This time, we're taking a trip to the crossroads of math and brain science.
Yeah, it's going to be an exciting one.
We're cracking open Neuroscience, a mathematical primer by Alwyn Scott.
A classic.
So get ready to see how equations can unlock the secrets of our brains.
From single neurons to the whole intricate network.
It's wild to think how far back these ideas actually go.
Oh yeah, way back. We're talking the 1800s. That's when we meet this German physicist, Hermann von Helmholtz.
Helmholtz, okay.
And he was obsessed with figuring out how fast nerve impulses actually travel.
Okay, I'm already hooked, but how do you even measure something like that back then?
Oh, he used frogs.
Frogs.
Yep, frogs. By attaching electrodes to their nerve fibers, he could actually time those impulses. And what he found, well, it was a game changer. Nerve impulses are way slower than electricity in a wire.
So our brains aren't just flipping light switches on and off.
Not even close.
Yeah.
Helmholtz showed us that nerve impulses are more like these carefully choreographed waves of energy released and dissipated along the fiber. And you know what? This whole idea of a coherent process, still totally relevant today. It's at the heart of understanding how signals travel in the brain.
So it's not just about the speed, it's about how the signal moves.
Exactly.
Now, we've talked about the signal, but what are these signals traveling through?
The neurons themselves. Now, picture this. Picture a neuron like a tree, all right?
Okay, a tree.
So you've got these branching dendrites, they're like the branches, right? And they're receiving information. Then you've got the cell body, that's like the trunk of the tree.
Right.
And finally, this long axon, like the main branch, transmitting signals to other neurons.
And those signals get passed from tree to tree, or I guess neuron to neuron at the synapses.
Bingo. The synapses, those are like tiny communication hubs, constantly buzzing with activity, connecting these neurons.
Okay, so how do we even begin to use math to make sense of something as complex as, well, as a nerve impulse?
Well, there are a couple of different approaches, and the book dives into two big ones. We've got nonlinear diffusion and molecular dynamics. Each one gives us a different way to see how these signals behave.
So it's like choosing the right tool for the job.
Exactly. Nonlinear diffusion, that's all about focusing on the big picture. Think of it like watching traffic patterns from a helicopter.
Okay.
You see the overall flow, but you're not focused on each individual car.
I got it. So you get the gist of the movement. What about molecular dynamics then? Does that get into the nitty-gritty?
You could say that. Molecular dynamics zooms all the way in, like street-level view, tracking every single car's movement.
So you're saying with nonlinear diffusion, you can actually let time run backward in your equations.
You got it.
But why would you even do that? Wouldn't that be like, I don't know, trying to unscramble an egg?
It might sound strange, but that's actually one of the really cool things about nonlinear diffusion,
Okay.
letting time flow both ways. It actually helps us see these stable patterns of activity that emerge in the brain.
So it's like finding the recurring themes in the brain's symphony instead of getting lost in each individual note.
Exactly. Beautiful way to put it.
Yeah.
Now, let's circle back to those communication hubs we talked about, those synapses.
Yeah.
They actually come in two main flavors. You've got chemical synapses and you've got electrical synapses.
So it's like choosing between snail mail and email.
Perfect analogy. Chemical synapses are like sending a letter. When a signal hits the end of a neuron's axon, it triggers the release of these chemical messengers called neurotransmitters.
Okay.
They drift across a tiny gap to the next neuron. Effective, for sure, but there's a slight delay.
So it's like waiting for the mailman to arrive.
Exactly. But what if you need to send a message instantly, like right now?
What's the brain's email equivalent then?
That's where electrical synapses come in. Picture them as, I don't know, like tiny tunnels.
Tunnels?
We call them gap junctions. They directly connect neurons. So ions can flow through these tunnels for practically instant communication.
Wow, so the brain has its own high-speed internet. But how do we even begin to model all this complexity mathematically? I mean, where do we even start?
Well, one of the first attempts was this thing called the McCulloch-Pitts neuron model, or the MP model. Think of it like a super simplified diagram of a neuron.
Okay.
Uses this basic on or off logic.
Like a light switch.
Exactly. If the incoming signals the input is strong enough, it crosses a certain threshold, boom, the neuron fires.
So it's like a light switch with a dimmer. If you push it far enough, the light comes on.
Exactly. It's a simple model, but believe it or not, it laid the groundwork for a lot of the artificial intelligence systems we have today.
Wow. That's incredible. But real neurons are way more complicated than just an on-off switch,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. That's where the idea of the multiplex neuron comes in.
The multiplex
It
neuron.
takes into account things like, how those dendrites branch out, the different regions of the axon, all that. It recognizes that a single neuron can process information in all sorts of sophisticated ways.
So it's like realizing that that light switch is actually a whole control panel with multiple inputs and outputs.
Exactly. The multiplex neuron model shows us that neurons aren't just passive relay stations. They're actively processing information, taking in multiple signals, integrating them, and then generating a response.
So each neuron is like a mini computer in itself.
Pretty much.
But all of this electrical activity needs a stage to play out on, right? That's where the neuron's membrane comes
But
in.
you got it. The membrane, it's made up of this lipid bilayer, and it acts like a barrier between the neuron's inner world and the outside world.
Okay.
But it's not just a passive barrier. It's crucial for how the whole neuron functions.
So it's not just a wall, it's an active participant.
Exactly. Imagine the lipid bilayer like I don't know, like a soap film.
Okay.
It's thin, it's flexible. And here's the thing, it actually minimizes surface energy. And just like a capacitor in an electrical circuit, this membrane can store electrical charge. We could call that membrane capacitance.
Oh yeah, I remember capacitors from physics class. They can store and release energy.
Right, you're on the right track. And that ability to store charge is vital for how neurons send signals because it affects how ions flow across the membrane.
Okay.
And that flow of ions, that's ultimately what drives those electrical impulses we keep talking about.
Makes sense. So we've got the players, we got the field. Now let's talk about the game itself. Who are some of the pioneers who helped us understand this whole dance of ions and electrical signals?
Well, you can't talk about this stuff without mentioning Alan Hodgkin and Andrew Huxley.
Yeah.
They won the Nobel Prize for their work on the giant squid axon.
A giant squid axon. Wow, they were thinking big.
Right. They used this unusually large axon because it was much easier to study. And they developed these techniques, space clamping and voltage clamping.
Sounds pretty high tech.
Oh, yeah, it was cutting edge for the time.
Yeah.
And from these experiments, they came up with a set of mathematical equations that could actually capture the dynamics of a nerve impulse. It was a monumental achievement.
So they created an equation that could predict how a signal would travel.
Pretty much. Their model took into account how specific ions move across the membrane, sodium and potassium, and how that changes the membrane's ability to conduct electricity. We call that conductance.
That's amazing. They could actually quantify something so complex. So what kind of insights did these equations reveal? What did they learn?
Well, for one, they predicted something called traveling wave solutions.
Okay.
And these represent that self-sustaining wave of electrical activity, the nerve impulse propagating down the axon.
So it's not just a passive flow of electricity, it's an active moving wave.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Their equations also predicted something called the threshold impulse. That's the critical level of stimulation needed to actually trigger an impulse. Think of it like the neuron having a tripwire.
Okay, I like that. So if the signal is strong enough to trip that wire, then bam, the neuron fires.
Yes. But then here's the interesting part. Why even have a tripwire?
Yeah, that's a good question. Wouldn't it be easier for neurons to just fire all the time?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. You see, if neurons were firing constantly, if neurons were firing all the time, it'd be chaos. Like trying to have a conversation in a room full of people just yelling, nonstop.
Oh, I see. It would be impossible to pick out any signal in all that noise.
Yeah.
So the threshold acts as a filter, right? Only the important stuff gets through.
You got it. The threshold makes sure that only the meaningful signals actually get amplified, prevents those random, or what we call spurious firings.
Spurious firings, got it.
Yeah, Hodgkin and Huxley's work, it also revealed these things called refractory and enhancement zones. They're really crucial for understanding how signals interact.
Okay. Refractory, that rings a bell. Isn't that like when you've been working out really hard and your muscles just can't do another rep?
Yeah, that's actually a good analogy. Think of the refractory period as a neuron's mandatory break time. After it fires an impulse, there's this short period, where it's much harder to get that neuron to fire again.
So no backseas for these signals.
Nope. It makes sure those impulses only travel one way down the axon.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about those enhancement zones? They sound a bit more energizing. What's going on there?
All right, picture this. You've got two friends walking towards each other, right? And they high-five each other.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
What happens?
Well, I guess they both get this little energy boost and keep going.
Exactly. And in an enhancement zone, the opposite of the refractory period happens. It actually becomes easier for a neuron to fire because of Well, because of the influence of other impulses. Like this can happen when impulses going in opposite directions, they collide, they give each other a little excitation boost.
So it's like a neural pep rally.
Yeah, something like that.
It seems like these interactions between the impulses are really key for understanding how information actually flows, how it's processed in the nervous system.
Absolutely. It's not just about the individual signals themselves. It's about how they interact and how they influence each other.
Okay, so let's zoom out a bit here. I mean, we've been talking about single neurons, but how does all this relate to the bigger picture, to the entire brain? I mean, how do we go from single cells to thoughts and memories and, to actions?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
One key idea is this concept of cell assemblies. These are like groups of interconnected neurons working together as like a team, right?
Okay.
They fire together to represent a specific piece of information or to carry out, a specific task.
So instead of solo players, it's like a whole neural orchestra.
That's a great way to put it. The idea was actually first proposed by Donald Hebb. This was way back in the 1940s.
Uh-huh.
And he's got this famous saying, neurons that fire together wire together,
Oh, yeah, I've heard that.
meaning that the connections between neurons that are frequently active at the same time, well, they get stronger over time.
Okay, so those strengthened connections, the synapses, they become the basis for learning and memory. It's like practicing a song over and over again. Your brain gets better at playing it because the connections between those neurons get more, I don't know, more efficient.
Precisely. Cell assemblies give us this framework for thinking about how the brain actually uses these networks of neurons to process information, to store those memories, and then ultimately to control how we behave.
Okay, so every new skill, every memory is like creating a new neural pathway.
Exactly.
That's amazing. But I'm curious, are synapses the only way that neurons can actually talk to each other? I mean, earlier we talked about those electrical synapses, like those direct lines. Is there anything else?
That is a great question, and it leads us to another fascinating thing. It's called ephaptic coupling.
Synaptic coupling, all right.
And believe it or not, neurons can actually communicate without even using synapses.
No way, really? What's going on there?
It's not magic, but it is pretty wild. With ephaptic coupling, neurons are actually communicating through these electric fields generated by, generated by their own activity.
So instead of direct signals, it's like they're creating this electric chatter that influences nearby neurons.
Exactly. Think of it like, imagine a group of people having a conversation, right, in a really crowded room. Even if they're not speaking directly to each other, that whole buzz of the conversation, the energy, can affect everyone in the room.
So neurons are actually sensitive to the electric vibe, like of their neighbors. That's crazy.
Yeah, it is. And it's a more subtle form of communication than the synaptic transmission. But it can still have a big impact on how those groups of neurons behave. Ephaptic coupling can help synchronize the firing of neurons, which is really important for things like rhythm generation, coordinating activity in different parts of the brain.
So it's like the conductor of our neural orchestra, keeping everyone in sync.
I like that. A very fitting analogy.
But it sounds like this ephaptic coupling, it's got to be pretty tough to study.
It is. It's really hard to isolate and measure these subtle electrical interactions between neurons.
I can only imagine it's like trying to hear a whisper in the middle of a rock concert.
Right. But it does make you wonder just how much we don't know about the brain. I mean, there could be all sorts of communication happening that we haven't even discovered yet.
That's kind of a mind-blowing thought.
It is. And that's what makes neuroscience so amazing. There's always something new to discover. We've come a long way, sure, in understanding the basics of neural communication, but there are so many mysteries left. And math is going to keep being this essential tool, as we explore those mysteries.
Speaking of mysteries, we've covered so much ground today, from frog legs to cell assemblies to this electric chatter between neurons. I mean, it's amazing how much we can learn about the brain just through the lens of mathematics. But before we go too deep into those mysteries, I got to ask, like, the big question that's probably on everyone's mind right now.
You mean, how does all of this, the ions and synapses and networks, how does it all lead to consciousness?
Yeah, exactly. How do these electrical and chemical signals create thoughts and emotions and like our whole experience of the world? It seems like such a huge leap.
It is a huge leap. And honestly, it's the question that keeps neuroscientists up at night. I mean, there's no one equation, no model that can completely explain how subjective experience comes from these objective physical processes in the brain.
So it's like the final frontier of the brain.
In many ways, yeah. But that doesn't mean we're not making progress. Every new thing we discover about how neurons communicate, how they form those networks, how those networks actually process information, well, it brings us a little bit closer to understanding, the neural basis of consciousness.
It's like we're putting together this giant puzzle, and we're starting to see the outlines of something really incredible.
I like that. And what's even more amazing is that we're finding that even individual neurons are capable of doing these really complex computations.
So it's not just about how many neurons you have, it's also about how they're connected and how they talk to each other.
Absolutely. Remember the multiplex neuron. A single neuron, it can receive input from thousands of other neurons, then process those signals in all these intricate ways, and then generate a response. And that response depends on a whole bunch of factors. That's a lot of computational power packed into this tiny little cell.
That is mind-boggling. If one neuron can do all that, just imagine what billions of them can do, all interconnected in these huge networks. It's like each neuron is its own universe, and our brain is like a whole multiverse.
And here's the thing. Those billions of neurons, they're not just sitting there passively. They're constantly changing, adapting, rewiring their connections in response to what's going on around them. It's a dynamic system, always evolving.
That makes it even more amazing. So where does this all leave us? What's the big takeaway for everyone listening?
I think the biggest takeaway is that the brain is this incredibly complex, fascinating organ, and we're really just starting to understand it. But by using math, with the ingenuity of these neuroscientists, we're making some really cool progress in figuring out how it works.
And who knows, maybe someday we'll actually crack the code of consciousness itself.
Maybe we will. But even if we don't fully solve that mystery, just exploring it is so rewarding. Every new insight we get into how the brain works, it just makes you appreciate even more the incredible things this organ can do. I mean, it makes us who we are.
It's like we've been given a glimpse into this vast, intricate machine, and we're just starting to see what it can really do.
Exactly. And that's what makes neuroscience so exciting. There's always something new to learn, always another layer to peel back.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive for today. It's been an amazing journey into the world of neurons and synapses and all those mathematical principles that kind of control how they behave.
It's been a pleasure sharing this journey with you and with everyone listening.
A huge thanks to all our listeners for joining us. Keep those neurons firing, and don't be afraid to keep exploring the fascinating world of neuroscience. You never know what incredible discoveries you might stumble upon.